Tuesday's attack on the segments of society who don't agree with their beliefs. These are liberal civil liberties groups, feminists, gays, lesbians, and pro-choice women. These people, they say, have turned God's anger against America. Quote, God continues to lift the curtain and allow the enemies of America to give us probably what we deserve. You'd hope that such talk would vanish in a week when sectarian hatred wreaks so much death and destruction in the name of religion.
Cato Byrne.
They're a disgrace, Margaret. Mayor Rudy Giuliani has performed splendidly during the awful hours since Tuesday morning. The man who was born to be New York's mayor has comforted and inspired all Americans. The outrage? Term limits that prohibit this urban statesman from seeking another term. New Yorkers who realize this week that Rudy is irreplaceable should be free to keep him in office.
Al Hunt.
Mark, late this week, Bush administration intelligence briefings to Congress were virtually meaningless. Members said they got more watching CNN. Now, if the administration thinks there's a problem with leaks, and there may well be, they should punish the specific congressional offender. But if we're in a war, it's not the executive branch war. Congress better be an equal partner or there will be hell to pay.
That's all for the Capitol Gang. Ahead, more coverage of America's new war. Thank you.
This is a CNN special report. America's new war. Resolve and remembrance. Calling on those in uniform to get ready, President Bush says flatly, America is at war.
And we will do whatever it takes to smoke them out and get them running, and we'll get them.
But is there a military solution? We'll hear from our correspondents. We'll speak live with former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger. And we'll be joined by Jeff Greenfield. Why adversaries underestimate the United States. As America begins burying its dead. A father's frantic search for his missing daughter. And we'll take you to New York's Ground Zero for a look at rescue crews searching for signs of life and what they're up against. Who did it? The worldwide investigation. And we'll hear how some hijackers learned to fly right here in the U.S. And we'll speak live with the man who ran their flight school.
Good evening, I'm Wolf Blitzer reporting tonight from Washington.
And I'm Greta Van Susteren.
Over the next hour, we will look closely at America's military options. What will and will not work to take care of the terrorists who caused Tuesday's deadly destruction.
And we'll look at the state of the investigation. We'll follow the trail left by the hijackers and their accomplices.
But first, let's update the developments at this hour. Meeting this morning with his national security team, President Bush said the terror attacks will not stand. He called Osama bin Laden the prime suspect and said America is in a war which it will win. With security concerns high across the country in the wake of the attacks, troops were on the scene tonight outside the Pentagon to aid in the efforts to remove a suspicious package. The investigation into Tuesday's deadly attacks continues with an arrest warrant issued for a second material witness. And even as New York begins laying the first victims to rest, officials say hope is alive. Rescue crews continue their desperate search in the rubble of the Twin Towers, where close to 5,000 people are still missing. After tests of communications links, the chairman of the New York Stock Exchange says all systems are go for Monday's reopening of both the New York Stock Exchange and the NASDAQ. Police, fire, and emergency representatives will ring the opening bell. 2 of the 4 flights that were hijacked Tuesday originated at Boston's Logan Airport. Amid heightened security and jangled nerves, Logan reopened today, but Washington's Reagan National Airport remains closed. Airlines are being allowed to remove stranded planes, but there's no word on when or if the airport, which is near the Pentagon and the White House, will be back in business. The airline business is hurting badly. Continental today furloughed 12,000 workers while urging Congress to help keep the industry going in the wake of the terror attacks. Continental's chairman says the industry is losing up to $300 million a day. President Bush says the United States is at war and vows to track down those responsible for this week's devastating terror attacks. Officials are not ruling out the use of ground troops. Let's go live now to the Pentagon and CNN's military affairs correspondent, Jamie McIntyre, for the latest. Jamie?
Well, Wolf, those were the words, "We're at war," from President Bush today up at Camp David, where he met with his national security team to plot strategy, their next move. Bush seemed to be preparing the United States public for a sweeping and sustained military campaign. These were some of his strongest words since the Tuesday attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, and he seemed to be preparing Americans for what could be a long campaign against those responsible for the deadly attacks.
They will try to hide. They will try to avoid the United States and our allies. But we're not going to let them. They run to the hills. They find holes to get in. And we will do whatever it takes to smoke them out and get them running, and we'll get them. And listen, this is a great nation. We're a kind people. None of us could have envisioned the barbaric acts of these terrorists. But they have stirred up the might of the American people. And we're going to get them for however long it takes.
The United States seemed to be also moving closer to naming Osama bin Laden as the person responsible for these. Again, President Bush calling him simply the prime suspect. At that Camp David session, he was flanked by both Vice President Dick Cheney and Secretary of State Colin Powell.
What we have to do is not just go after these perpetrators and those who gave them haven, but the whole curse of terrorism that is upon the face of the earth. And this is a campaign that we have begun this week, and we will stick with it until we are successful.
And again, no one here is giving any indication of precisely what kind of military response may be in the offing. But again, White House spokesman Ari Fleischer saying today that he did not rule out the use of ground troops. Wolf?
Jamie, is there any indication from your sources over there or elsewhere in Washington about the nature of the specific military action the United States might be preparing for?
Well, they're playing it pretty close to the vest, Wolf, but you get the feeling here of a couple of things. One, from talking to people at the Pentagon, I have the feeling that nothing is imminent, certainly not in the next couple of days. And two, you get the feeling that when they're talking about this sustained campaign, they're not necessarily talking about military strikes day after day, but a long campaign of pressure that would be punctuated by perhaps aerial bombings and even perhaps the use of special forces on the ground to try to snatch or kill Osama bin Laden. The big thing that's changed here is the so-called zero casualty mentality. Before this, the Pentagon had to be sure that they were going to take almost no casualties in an operation. But now with the number of casualties here in the United States mounting, public support will be behind the Pentagon, even if some of the troops lose their lives in the pursuit and the fight against terrorism. Wolf?
Jamie McIntyre at the Pentagon, thank you very much. He knows as much as anyone about long, bitter conflicts. He won the Nobel Peace Prize for his role in the Vietnam Accord, and he invented shuttle diplomacy in the Middle East. Joining us now from Kent, Connecticut, is the former Secretary of State, Dr. Henry Kissinger. Dr. Kissinger, welcome to our program. And let me just begin by asking you this. The United States had a bitter experience in a guerrilla war in Vietnam. The Soviets had a bitter experience in a guerrilla war in Afghanistan. What makes U.S. officials, perhaps even you, think the United States will have any better experience in Afghanistan than the Russians had?
This is a different kind of war. In Vietnam, we tried to control the territory and to preserve it from a communist attack. In Afghanistan, the Russians tried to conquer the whole territory. The purpose of whatever operations are being considered now is not to hold any territory, not to occupy any territory, but to get the terrorists on the run, as Secretary Powell said, and to keep them on the run and make it impossible for them to operate and to destroy them if we can.
So what is the best military and diplomatic step, if you will, that the United States can pursue right now?
I would make a distinction between two kinds of actions. One is retaliation against the perpetrators of this outrage. And when we have identified them, and I think we are clear enough that Osama bin Laden, whether he was behind this one or not, has been behind enough of them, that he's clearly an international terrorist. Second is to break up the networks that exist independent of Osama bin Laden around the world. For the first, once we have identified the target, we should go after it by means that the Pentagon can describe better than I can. For the second one, I think countries have to be put on notice that safe havens will no longer, for terrorists, will no longer be accepted by the United States. These terrorists cannot undertake the actions that we have experienced last week unless they have a base from which they operate, unless they have an organization, communications. It takes a long planning, and we cannot permit them the period of quiet in which they prepare and then they strike us. So I think we should declare a policy that safe havens will not be accepted, and that therefore governments run the risk, not just from the terrorists of whom they may be afraid, but of American and hopefully other countries' reaction. It shouldn't be only military. Countries that offer safe havens should be cut off from communications with other countries, if at all possible.
Well, is that the extent of it? You say that safe havens should not be tolerated. Should the United States go to war against these countries?
No, they shouldn't go technically to war, but the countries should be put on notice first that there will be severe penalties, that countries that tolerate terrorist bases on their soil hopefully will be cut off from all visas, from all financial transactions, and from all economic reactions. Secondly, we and our allies should reserve the right to strike militarily at these bases and at institutions that support these bases. That shouldn't be the first step, but it should be a step that is clearly available, because now that this outrage has been committed, we should not stop until the back of these terrorist networks has been broken.
Well, which leads me to my next question, Dr. Kissinger, the sensitive issue of assassination. The executive order on the books right now in the United States says this: no person employed by or acting on behalf of the United States government shall engage in or conspire to engage in assassination. We spoke about 10 days or so ago, before these terrorist attacks, about this issue in connection with the Israeli policy. That time you said, and I'm quoting you, it is the absolutely correct policy of the United States not to engage in assassination as an act of governmental policy. Is this an extraordinary circumstance, though, that has now developed?
I think as a basic policy, it is the correct policy of the United States. But we may have to review a number of the restrictions that have been put on intelligence services to prevent a repetition of what happened or anything like what has happened.
And I think you will agree.
But that is a very extreme step, which we should look at with extreme care.
But a lot of experts have pointed out, and you probably will agree, that even if Osama bin Laden, who may or may not have been responsible for these acts, were captured or killed, the problem would not necessarily be resolved.
I think it would be a terrible mistake if we became so obsessed with Osama bin Laden that we would be satisfied with the destruction of himself or of his own headquarters. This is now a wake-up call for a systematic attack on all terrorist groups of international reach.
Dr. Kissinger, I want you to listen to the very strong, powerful words uttered today by President Bush. Listen to this.
We're at war. There's been an act of war declared upon America by terrorists, and we will respond accordingly. And I appreciate very much the American people understanding that.
Do you have any fear that President Bush may be under too much pressure to respond quickly without a well-thought-out plan?
I'm not going to second-guess President Bush. I totally support what he has said. I think the American people should support him. I hope and expect that there will be a plan that will not be satisfied with one retaliatory strike, but that goes to the heart of the problem. And I have every confidence from my knowledge of the people involved that that is what they will do.
Dr. Kissinger, looking back over the past many years, how did the United States get itself into this current predicament?
Well, it's very difficult for a society like ours, which has such an ease of social contact, to come up against people whose hatred is so deep that they live off their hatred, that they're willing to destroy themselves and thousands of innocent civilians in order to achieve their fundamental objective, which is really to change the structure of societies. So what we have done up to now, when there has been a terrorist attack, we treated it as a criminal act, and we thought we'd concentrate on the individuals who did it, bring them to justice, and believe that that was a deterrent. But the ones we can catch are the secondary individuals anyway. Or we would make a one-time retaliation, which was usually very ineffective. I understand that. It is very hard for a society like ours to understand the nature of terrorism. And in fact, when allies of ours, like Israel, were faced with terrorism, we always urged them to take a very measured response. Now we are faced with a situation where we have experienced it on our own territory. We've never faced an attack on the continental United States, and it's on top of an attack of such magnitude. But the people who perpetrated this attack misunderstood America. And I believe we are now going to go after this and root it out, and that's what we have to do.
Dr. Kissinger, it's always good to hear from you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Pleasure to be on.
Thank you. And President Bush says this will be, in his words, quote, a different kind of conflict against a different kind of enemy. To find out why, let's turn now to our CNN national security correspondent, David Ensor. David, tell us why this is different.
Well, for so many reasons. The whole field is different. There are so many different reasons why it is, and let me go to them.
An angry and determined president is promising action.
We will find those who did it. We will smoke them out of their holes.
But if Osama bin Laden is the culprit, revenge against him or against his hosts, the Afghan Taliban government, will not be easy. Cruise missiles fired in 1998 missed bin Laden and may only have strengthened his image. Even if bin Laden is killed, many analysts say that would not stop terrorism by his followers.
I would want to destroy as much of bin Laden as possible. I'm simply saying that's like picking a wart off your neck or something. That doesn't do much. That's a very superficial blow against this kind of capability.
To get rid of one man or to launch any kind of revenge attack isn't going to help. Revenge alone is not an answer. There has to be a complete eradication and elimination of all the training camps.
But bombing alone would not likely achieve that. And there are indications those terrorist training camps in Afghanistan are today largely empty. Much of bin Laden's support is across the border in Pakistan, in the area around Peshawar. One reason the promise by Pakistani President Musharraf to help the U.S. against the terrorists could be crucial.
I especially want to thank the President and people of Pakistan for the support that they have offered and their willingness to assist us in whatever might be required in that part of the world as we determine who these perpetrators are.
But can Musharraf convince his military and intelligence services to stop their long and active support for the Taliban?
Pakistan is supplying fuel, funding, infrastructure, training, arms, and administrative help to the Taliban. Without the Pakistani lifeline, the Taliban would not survive.
Senior administration officials warn none of this is going to be easy or quick, and that the United States cannot do it alone. It could, in fact, take years, analysts say, of political, economic, and military effort before Americans can overcome their newfound fear of mass terrorism on U.S. soil.
We're talking about a war, and that's a campaign. And in a campaign, there are going to be a lot of battles. We're going to win some of these battles. We're going to lose some of these battles. There are going to be more civilian casualties on both sides. More Americans will die.
Before it is over, many analysts believe, in fact, that U.S. ground troops in the region may be required. For now, though, the main effort of the Bush team is diplomacy, an effort to build a strong international coalition, much as the president's father did before the Gulf War, Wolf.
Well, the U.S., the Bush administration says, David, they're getting good response from Pakistan. What's to suggest that there will be the appropriate follow-up in addition just to the words?
Well, that's right. They have at least, first of all, been told that the first requests are possible, and one of those was overflights. So that makes it possible to take military action flying over Pakistani territory. But of course, if there have to be ground troops going into Afghanistan, Pakistan is the obvious staging post. They would need that. That'll be very, very difficult for Musharraf to say yes to. It could lead to insurrection in Pakistan.
All right. David Ensor, our national security correspondent, thanks so much for joining us. And what kind of options does the U.S. military have? CNN military consultant General Wesley Clark joins us now. General Clark, when you were NATO's supreme allied commander, there was a war in the Balkans. You got the job done mostly through air power. What are the military options in dealing, presumably, with Osama bin Laden and his network of terrorists?
Well, I think we have to start by following up on everything that's been said so far. Principally, we're in a diplomatic effort to build a coalition. When we get that diplomatic coalition built, then we expect support, we expect information, we expect action by police forces and interior ministry forces in these various countries, maybe their own armed forces going against the terrorist cells. We expect these people to be detained. We expect to get information about this that will help us crack open other terrorist cells and go after their headquarters. None of that necessarily involves the U.S. military, and ideally, there will be no requirement for U.S. military forces. The ideal world is the Taliban would have a change of heart and turn in Osama bin Laden. Now, that's not very likely, but that's the course of action that is the most desirable in this case. Whatever we do, though, the world knows it's backed up by American military might. And what we've got in this case is the full arsenal of the United States at work. We saw it in Kosovo.
You're standing, General Clark, in front of a map. Show our viewers the complications of military action in, presumably, Afghanistan.
We've done airstrikes with cruise missiles in Afghanistan in the past. We did it in 1998. But it's a long way into Afghanistan, and I don't know exactly the route of the cruise missiles, but however they came a long way. They take time to fly. We've got permission now to use Pakistan's airspace if necessary, but cruise missiles are limited. You launch them, they're on a fixed target, and they're only going to strike facilities, a fixed point in the ground. So we've got other options. We could use manned bombers. They're more flexible. We've got options to put small teams in there who could direct the forces. We've got options to put slightly larger teams in there who could actually engage small groups of terrorists, detain them, bring them to justice, or fight it out if that was necessary and extract them. And finally, we've got an option, if we had to, we could put larger forces in. But all of these options take careful preparation, staging, and timing. Now,
General Clark, let me interrupt for a second. If you look at that map, you see Pakistan, you see Iran, you see the former Central Asian countries of the former Soviet Union, none of which seem to be a good staging point for U.S. military force if there's going to be ground force, for example.
This has got to be the toughest area in the world to go after. It's a long way from the ocean. We don't have the mileage scale on this, but this is hundreds of miles, this distance right here. And to get in there, we would probably stage through Pakistan. Other armies have followed this invasion route. The British did, up to Kabul twice in the 19th century. It's a very tough route. We could stage through the states of Central Asia. The Russians have done that. That's also very tough. But remember, what we're going after here is a network of terrorists. We're not going to occupy a country. We're not fighting a state. In that sense, it's totally different than World War II. It's what the president means. It's a new kind of war. We've got the military muscle behind us, but the first line of action is diplomatic, intelligence, informational, and police.
General Wesley Clark, thanks once again for joining us. We really appreciate your insight.
Thank you.
Thank you. And life goes on for many thousands who live near Ground Zero in Lower Manhattan, but it's not life as usual and likely never will be again. CNN's Brian Palmer joins us now with more on that. Brian?
Good evening, Wolf. Tonight we're actually in Jersey City, New Jersey, just across the Hudson River from what used to be the magnificent skyline of Lower Manhattan. This afternoon, we were walking around the neighborhoods just north of the blast zone and the contained zone, talking to residents who fled the blast but who are trickling back in to pick up belongings, but they are not staying.
This morning I'm standing by the door there and I hear the plane. I look up and I just see this huge explosion.
Film producer Kevin Segala saw the obliteration of a landmark from his terrace with his one-year-old son Griffin. Segala and his wife Michelle returned to their apartment for the first time.
My life, the moment that plane went into the building, really pretty much stopped. I think everybody's lives have stopped. I don't live here anymore. I haven't been to work again.
This was the view from his terrace that day. This is the view now. The area around Ground Zero covers about 5 square miles and was home to roughly 50,000 people. When the towers collapsed, the familiar rhythm of life stopped in this corner of Manhattan. The West Side Highway, one of the main roads downtown, now the primary route for the massive recovery operation, as well as a staging area for the effort, complete with a mobile animal hospital. On the once bustling street corners of fashionable Tribeca, military checkpoints. 20 miles of high-voltage cable, all installed since Tuesday, snake through the streets of Lower Manhattan. Shuttered stores and a few reminders of the devastation just 7 blocks away. Few shoppers, many curious passers-by and shell-shocked residents, many moving in with family and friends north of the area.
Everyone is so focused on the rescue that all of us in the neighborhood who are displaced are really secondary, and that's how it should be, except we don't know what to do. So we're hoping to try to organize amongst ourselves.
Every bit of activity out there is geared towards this disaster, and you walk out there and you can't get it out of your head if you're seeing it every second.
Seeing it every second, living like this for months, normal life as it was before, likely years away. Wolf, it was almost like people were apologetic about telling their story, saying certainly their suffering couldn't match the suffering of the people who lost their lives or the people who lost loved ones. But I think these examples they represent the ripple effect that such a horrific event has throughout a community, throughout a city, and then across the whole world. Wolf?
Brian, I can't get over that view right behind you, that view that used to have the World Trade Center, the Twin Towers right there. You've spoken to people who've been looking at that view for years and now for a few days have a very different view. What are they saying to you?
Well, it's similar to the things that you've been hearing all week. Disbelief, people call it surreal. I just got up to this position about an hour ago and I couldn't stop looking at it because it's almost like our idea of permanence has changed. These 2 solid and enduring landmarks just disappeared.
Brian Palmer, just across the river from Manhattan, thank you so much for being with us tonight. And a final farewell today in New York to 3 of the city's many heroes, firefighters who lost their lives in the Trade Center attacks. Hundreds turned out to mourn 68-year-old Franciscan priest Michael Judge, who'd been the fire department's chaplain for 10 years. He died while administering last rites to a fallen firefighter. The priest who eulogized him says even at the end of his life, the chaplain commanded respect.
Child of God, lift up your head. Patriarchs from distant ages, saints all longing for their end. Prophets, psalmists, seers,
I think it was beautiful. The firemen took his body, and because they respected and loved him so much,